What do you do when everything you were told to become turns out to be everything you are not? What if the only thing standing between you and a cold street is a pair of worn leather gloves and a skill that an entire town has already decided has no place there? They called her foolish for trying. They called the old Cooperage a hazard, a ruin, an eyesore on the edge of Hartwell that no sensible person would touch. But the truth hidden inside those warped staves and crumbling hoops was something the town of Hartwell had quietly needed for years without knowing it. Come in close now. Find yourself a comfortable place to settle. Let us know in the comments where in Canada you're watching from tonight, as we tell you the story of Lena Voss and the barrel maker's workshop that nobody wanted. Lena Voss arrived in the town of Hartwell with a canvas bag on her shoulder, $43 in a tin she kept pinned inside her coat, and a Cooperage mallet that had belonged to her teacher, Amos Frey. The mallet was old. Its handle had been worn smooth in one particular groove where his thumb had always rested, and she had taken to resting her own thumb there without thinking about it. It was the kind of habit that grief creates. She was 22 years old. She had no family in Hartwell or anywhere else that counted. Her mother had gone when she was 6, her father when she was 14, and the only person in her life who had looked at her and seen something useful instead of something inconvenient had been Amos Frey, the barrel maker in the village of Sable Creek, 300 kilometers to the north. He had taken her on as an apprentice when she was 16. He had taught her to read the grain of white oak. He had taught her to feel the tension in a hoop before it failed. He had died quietly in his sleep the previous winter, and the man who owned the building had sold the workshop within the week. So she had packed what was hers, taken the mallet because it was the one thing no one else wanted, and gone south toward Hartwell because Amos had once mentioned it as a town where people still put up fruit and still needed proper casks for it. The town had not been expecting her. The main street was tidy in the way of towns that take pride in appearances. There was a feed store, a bakery with a green awning, a hardware merchant, a small hotel with a hand-lettered sign that read rooms by the week. Lena drove the borrowed truck she had hitched a ride in as far as the crossroads, and then walked the rest of the way in. Faces turned as she came down the street with her canvas bag and her quietness. She was young, and she was alone, and she carried herself without apology, which in certain kinds of towns is a thing people notice. Her first stop was to find Marion Gaudet, a woman Amos had mentioned once or twice in passing. Marion ran the hardware store with her husband, or had before her husband passed. She was a compact, watchful woman with the kind of hands that have touched every tool in the place and know where each one belongs. She looked at Lena over the counter with a measuring gaze that was not unkind. "You're Amos Frey's girl," she said. It wasn't a question. "He taught me coopering for 6 years," Lena said. "I'm looking for a place to set up." Marion set down the catalog she had been holding. "There's nothing in town. The Delacroix Cooperage closed in 1987. Nobody's needed barrels made here in 30 years. People buy them now. Plastic, fiberglass." She paused. "Or they just don't bother." Lena had expected this. "There's a building," she said. "The old Cooperage. I saw it on the way in, on Millbrook Road." Marion's expression shifted into something careful. "That place has been sitting empty for 35 years. Roof's half gone. The town's been arguing about tearing it down since before you were born. Rémi Gagnon owns it now, and he's been trying to sell the lot for the timber value." She paused again. "He won't get much." Lena asked who held the deed and whether there was a number she could call. Marion looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote a number on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter. "Don't get your hopes up," she said, "and don't pay more than it's worth," which is not very much. Lena thanked her and went to find a payphone. She called Rémi Gagnon that afternoon. He was a man whose voice had the particular quality of someone who expects conversations to cost him time and deliver him nothing. He quoted her a price. She was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic against the $43 in her tin. When she spoke again, she offered him the $38 for the building and the lot pending her inspection of the deed. He laughed, a short sound more surprise than amusement. He accepted. $38. It was nearly everything she had. She walked to Millbrook Road as the sun was going flat and orange against the western tree line. The Cooperage sat at the edge of a field that had gone back to scrub. It was a long, low building of board and batten, the boards bleached silver by decades of weather. One end of the roof had collapsed inward over what must have been the workshop floor. The walls stood, mostly. The great sliding door on the south side was seized shut with rust and growth. There were no windows left intact. A single apple tree grew at the corner of the building, its branches pressing against the wall as though trying to hold it up. She stood there a long time. Amos had always said that a building tells you what it needs if you're willing to stand still and listen. She stood still. The building sagged and creaked in the early evening wind. It told her it was tired. It told her it had been waiting. The despair came later, when she had managed to lever the side door open with a length of scrap iron she found in the grass and stepped inside. The smell was old wood and cold earth, and the ghost of something ferrous and familiar. Hoop iron. Her eyes adjusted. The workshop floor was buried under 35 years of fallen debris. What she had thought was a collapsed roof section was actually the remains of a second-floor storage loft, which had let go at some point and brought a section of roofing down with it. The main structural beams still stood. They were old-growth timber, massive and square-cut, and where she could reach them, she ran her hand along the grain and felt that they were sound. The floor underneath the debris was packed earth and wide plank. Original. The hearth at the far end, where the bending fire would have been for steaming the staves, was a massive block of fieldstone, intact. She could see the iron crane arms still mounted in the mortar. It was worse than she had let herself imagine. And yet, the bones were there. The bones were good. She sat on the threshold in the failing light, with her back against the door frame, and felt the full weight of what she had done. $38. Her teacher's mallet in her lap. A building full of broken things. The town did not want a Cooperage. The town did not know it did. The tears came then, quick and private, and she let them come. Then she put them away. She had her deed, signed that same afternoon in the land office on K Street, the paper still smelling faintly of the clerk's coffee. She had her canvas bag and her mallet, and the gloves Amos had given her in her second year, the ones he said would outlast her if she oiled them right. She had a building that still had its bones. It was, she allowed herself to think, a beginning. The mockery was not slow in coming. She had set up a rough camp inside the building's driest corner. A canvas tarpaulin strung between two upright posts, a bedroll, a camp stove, a crate for her few things, and had begun the work of clearing debris when she first heard them talking. Two men outside the feed store the next morning. She was passing on her way to the hardware store for fasteners, and they did not lower their voices. "Heard somebody bought the old Delacroix place," one said. "Young woman," the other replied. "From up north somewhere, going to make barrels." A pause, and she could hear the flavor of the smile in it. Barrels. They did not say anything worse than that. They didn't need to. In the hardware store, a man named Bernard Tugas, who introduced himself as the owner without being asked, looked at her list and then looked at her. "You're at the Cooperage," he said. "I am," she said. He made a sound that was close to sympathy and a long way from confidence. "That building's been condemned twice. Town never followed through. It's going to be a lot of work for a business that hasn't existed here in 40 years. He put her supplies on the counter. "People drive to the city now for what they need." She paid for her supplies. She thanked him and meant it. Condescension she could endure. What she could not have endured was pity that asked her to quit. She was tying her supplies to the back of a borrowed cart when the shadow fell. Rémi Gagnon was on the opposite side of the road, talking to a man in a wool coat, who had the look of someone who makes decisions with other people's money. Rémi saw her and crossed over. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, and he had the easy authority of someone who has always owned things. "Voss," he said, "how's your new property?" She looked at him and said nothing. He seemed to find this entertaining. "I had a developer interested in that lot. He offered me $5,000 for the timber alone." He hooked his thumbs in his pockets. "I took your 38 because I thought it was funny, frankly. A girl with a hammer showing up wanting to make barrels in a town that hasn't needed barrels since your mother was born." He tilted his head. "When you're done playing, give me a call. I'll buy it back for 20. Save you the embarrassment of climbing out of there on your own." He walked away without waiting for a response. The man in the wool coat glanced at her, assessed her, and followed. Lena stood by the cart. The morning was cold. There was frost still on the north side of the feed store awning. She was aware that 2 or 3 people had watched that exchange from the sidewalk, and she was aware of what they had seen. A young woman and a successful man, and no prizes for guessing which one the town would take seriously. What they had not seen was the anger that had just replaced the last of her self-doubt. Not a hot anger, a cold one, the kind that is useful. She picked up the cart handles and started back toward Millbrook Road. She had gone perhaps half a block when a voice stopped her, old and dry as pine shavings. "He sold that property cheap for a reason, you know." An old man was sitting on an overturned milk crate in the narrow gap between the bakery and the pharmacy. He was bundled in a canvas coat, a trapper's hat pulled low. His hands, resting on his knees, were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical work. "What reason?" Lena asked. He looked at her with the direct attention of someone who does not need to perform interest. "Delacroix didn't just leave the Cooperage," he said. "He left a lot behind. Remy wanted the lot clear so he could sell it. Didn't want the complication." "What complication?" The old man looked at her for another moment, then shifted his gaze to something down the road. "Go look under the floorboards in the back section," he said, "where the curing rack used to be, and pay attention to what's growing against the east wall." He said nothing else. His attention had moved to somewhere far off, and she understood, without being told, that the conversation was finished. She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. She walked on, his words settling into her like stones dropping into still water. Not making sense yet, but making depth. The work that followed was the hardest she had ever done, and she had done hard work. She had watched Amos split and shave staves in weather that cracked the wood before you could set the plane to it. She knew what sustained physical labor felt like. But clearing the Cooperage was different, because every piece of debris she moved revealed something she had to assess and then decide about, and the decisions never stopped. She started with the collapsed loft. The secondary timbers were rotted through and had to come out entirely. The main beams, once she had cleared enough debris to reach them, proved to be what she had suspected. Old-growth white oak, still sound, still square. She marked them to be kept. The roof section over the collapsed end had to be rebuilt, and that was a project beyond her alone, and she set it aside for later. The floor she cleared plank by plank, pulling each board and checking it, and either stacking it for reuse or adding it to the burn pile. Beneath the planks was packed earth, and beneath certain boards in the back section, where the old curing rack had been, the old man had said, the earth had a different color, darker, richer. She knelt and dug her fingers into it. It was not decay. It was soil that had been worked, turned, composted over a long time. It was not the kind of earth you find under a workshop floor by accident. She remembered what he had said. Pay attention to what's growing against the east wall. She went outside and looked. The east wall was mostly hidden behind 30 years of encroaching growth. Sumac, thistle, burdock. She spent an afternoon cutting it back, working methodically from the building outward. And as she cut, she found that underneath the coarser growth, pressed tight against the foundation, where the fieldstone met the ground, there was something else growing. It was low and dense, spreading in flat rosettes, with leaves that were dusty green on the top and white on the underside. The flowers were small, yellow, and had already gone to seed for the season. She didn't recognize it, but it was not a weed in the common sense. It was tended-looking, old and deliberate. She cut a stem and crushed the leaf between her fingers. The smell was clean and complicated, astringent, with something underneath it she could not name. Another piece to the puzzle. She went back to clearing the floor. It was on a cold Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after she had moved in, that her pry bar slipped between two of the back section boards and struck something that rang hollow and metallic. She stopped. She worked the bar back into the gap and livered the plank up. Beneath it was a shallow space between the floor joists, and in it sat a wooden crate, small with a hinged lid, sealed with a wedge of wood banged tight into the hasp. It had been wrapped in waxed canvas that had largely dried and crumbled, but had done its job. The crate was dry. The wood was sound. She carried it outside into the gray November light and set it on the stack of reclaimed planks she had been building. Chickadees moved in the apple tree. She worked the wedge free with a screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that was still largely intact, were 3 things. A set of Cooperage gauges, the fine brass measuring tools a professional barrel maker uses to calibrate the curvature of staves. A small bound ledger, its cover stamped in faded gold with the initials GD, and a folded document, stiff and yellowed, which turned out to be an official record of a plant variety registration, dated 1961 from the Department of Agriculture of the province of Quebec. She picked up the ledger first. The handwriting inside was small and precise. The name on the first page was Gustave Delacroix, Master Cooper, and beneath that, in smaller writing, "These notes are kept for the one who comes after, if anyone does." Lena sat down on the plank pile and began to read. Gustave Delacroix had not been a simple barrel maker. He had spent 40 years in the Cooperage, but his real obsession, laid out in meticulous, careful entries across 200 pages, was a particular variety of white oak that grew in a stand 3 kilometers east of Hartwell, on land that had once been his family's farm. He called it the Hartwell oak. He had been cultivating it for 3 decades, selecting for specific properties. Tighter grain, lower tannin, a particular sweetness in the char that he believed was unique. He had registered the variety in 1961 under his own name. He had spent 20 years trying to interest the Quebec distilling industry in what he had. The letters he received in return, a few of which were tucked into the back of the ledger, were polite and dismissive. He was considered an eccentric. He had died in 1988, alone, his work unrecognized. His son, Ramey's father-in-law, had sold the property and left the Cooperage to sit. Lena lowered the ledger slowly. She looked at the Cooperage gauges, the finest set she had ever held. She looked at the plant registration document, and then she looked at the east wall, at the low green plants pressed against the foundation, and she understood. They were not wildflowers. They were oak seedlings. Hundreds of them, nursed along the foundation line year after year, self-seeding in the rich dark soil beneath the workshop floor, where the old man had told her to look. A living nursery that no one had noticed because no one had looked. The Hartwell oak was still here. Delacroix's work was still here, sleeping but alive. She pressed her palm flat against the cold ground and stayed there for a long moment. Around her, the wind moved through the scrub at the edge of the field. Somewhere up the road, a door banged. The apple tree shifted. She thought of Amos. She thought of the groove worn into the mallet handle. She thought of every person who had looked at her since she arrived and seen an inconvenience. Then she stood up, put Gustave Delacroix's gauges carefully in her canvas bag beside her own tools, and went back inside to work. The months that followed took on the rhythm of the work itself. Early mornings and late evenings, cold hands, the smell of sawdust and old stone. She rebuilt the collapsed end of the roof with salvaged timber, learning by doing, making mistakes and correcting them, the building slowly becoming something other than a ruin. She had no money for a contractor. She had Marion Gadet, who turned out to know more about structural carpentry than most people with licenses, and who showed up one Saturday morning without being asked, with a truck and her own tools and a dry remark about the roof pitch. "You didn't ask for help," Marion said, pulling on her gloves. "I didn't think you'd come," Lena said honestly. "Amos Frey sent a letter years ago," Marion said, already looking at the roofline with an assessing eye. "Told me to look out for a girl he was teaching. Said she'd need someone who could see what was actually there, not what seemed to be there." She glanced at Lena. He was usually right about things. That was the only explanation Marion ever gave, and Lena did not ask for another. She had written to 3 distilleries in the first weeks, careful letters explaining the Hartwell oak, the registered variety, Delacroix's notes. 2 did not reply. The third sent back a letter so brief it was nearly a brush-off. A junior operations person who said they would keep her information on file. She set the letters aside and kept working. She had begun transplanting the oak seedlings from the foundation line, following Delacroix's notes on spacing and soil, laying out a small nursery grove in the cleared field behind the Cooperage. The work was painstaking. Many of the seedlings were fragile from growing in poor light and thin soil. She lost a third of them in the first transplanting. She adjusted her methods and lost fewer the second time. She began making barrels. Her first finished piece was a 20-gallon aging cask in reclaimed white oak from the dismantled loft. Not Hartwell oak, not yet, but sound timber worked with Delacroix's gauges and her own hands. She set it on the workbench and looked at it for a long time. It was a good barrel. She knew it was good the way you know something in your chest before your eyes have finished checking. She brought it to the farmer's market in December, along with 4 smaller pickling crocks. She had made a simple sign. She stood behind her table in the cold and waited. Most people walked past. A few stopped to look. An older man picked up one of the crocks and turned it in his hands, and she explained the joinery, and he bought it. A woman asked if she made whiskey barrels, and Lena said not yet, but that she was growing toward it, and the woman laughed with surprised approval and bought one of the small casks for a wedding gift. She sold 6 pieces that first market. It was not enough to live on. It was enough to continue. The talk in town shifted slightly, not to acceptance, not yet, but to the particular murmur of a place that is beginning to wonder whether it was wrong. She heard it in the way people at the hardware store were slightly less careful now about how they spoke around her. She heard it in the way Bernard Tuga started setting her supplies aside before she asked, because he had noticed she came in on the same day every 2 weeks. Rémy Gagnon said nothing to her, but she noticed him slow his truck once, passing on Millbrook Road, and look at the Cooperage, with an expression she could not read from that distance. The old man in the canvas coat came by once, in late February, when the snow was hip-deep along the fences and the sky had been gray. For so long she had forgotten what blue looked like. He stood at the open workshop door and looked at the interior. At the cleared floor, the rebuilt roof section, the new workbench, the curing rack she had reconstructed from Delacroix's sketches, and he said nothing for a long time. "Gustave would have liked this," he said finally. She looked up from the stave she was shaping. "Did you know him?" "I was his apprentice for 2 years," the old man said. "Before I went into the bush." He looked at the curing rack. "He used to say that good work doesn't disappear, it just waits." He didn't come in. He nodded once and walked back down the road through the snow, and she watched him go. This person who had pointed her toward what she needed at exactly the right moment and had asked nothing of her in return. She turned back to her stave and kept working. Spring arrived sideways in Hartwell, as it does in that part of the country. A week of warmth, then a hard frost, then mud, then a morning when you step outside and the air has changed for good. The oak seedlings in the nursery grove had survived the winter better than she had hoped. New growth was coming in on 2/3 of them, small and determined against the last patches of snow. It was mid-April when the letter arrived from Glenmoranich Distillery, a craft operation in the eastern townships that had, as it turned out, been given her original letter by the junior operations person who had left the company 6 months prior. The new head of production had found it in a file and been curious enough to write back. He asked if he could visit. His name was Thomas Chouinard. He arrived on a Thursday in a pickup truck that had seen real work, which she appreciated. He was in his 40s, methodical, and he had the particular stillness of someone who tastes things for a living and has learned to wait for what's actually there. She showed him the Cooperage. She showed him Delacroix's ledger, the registered variety, the notes on tannin ratios and grain density. She took him out to the nursery grove and showed him the young Hartwell oaks, and she explained what she was working toward. That, within 3 to 5 years, she would have harvestable timber from the first managed planting, and that in the meantime she was sourcing Hartwell oak from the original stand east of town to begin small batch production. He listened without interrupting. He picked up a section of Hartwell oak stave she had cut from a fallen tree in the original grove and held it to the light and examined the grain the way she might have examined it, which was the thing that told her most about him. "This is real," he said, not to her, but to himself. He looked up. "Delacroix submitted samples to us. In 1974, my predecessor's predecessor turned them down. I found the record." He turned the stave in his hands again. "I've been trying to understand why for a year." She waited. "It was because he couldn't supply volume," Thomas said, "not because the product wasn't right." He looked at the nursery grove through the workshop window. "Can you supply volume eventually?" "Yes," she said, "not immediately, but yes." He stayed for 2 hours. He tasted the first batch of test spirit she had put up in a reclaimed Hartwell barrel over the winter. Only 20 liters, her own experiment, not even whiskey in any legal sense, just a proof of concept. He was quiet for a long time after that. "I want to bring our master distiller here in June," he said. After he left, Lena stood in the empty Cooperage for a while. The light came in through the south window she had reglazed in February. It lay in a warm band across the workbench, across the gauges, across the mallet with its worn groove. She did not allow herself more than a few minutes of this. There was work to do. What Thomas Chouinard told people after his visit was not the kind of story that stays quiet in a small town. He had family in Hartwell, a cousin it turned out, and small towns have their own particular circulatory system for news. Within a week, the story had moved, that a distillery in the townships had come to see the Cooperage, that the young woman on Millbrook Road was sitting on something that the industry had been looking for since the 1970s, that Gustave Delacroix had been right all along, and that his work had survived because someone had come along who knew how to look. Marion Godet came by and set a bottle of maple syrup on the workbench without saying why. Bernard Tugas gave her a tradesperson's discount she had not asked for, and did not explain. People at the Saturday market started asking for her by name. Rémy Gagnon sent a handwritten note through his lawyer, offering to purchase the property back at a figure that was, she noticed, significantly more than $38. She read the note, folded it carefully, and put it in the tin that had once held her last $43, and now held, instead, the seed receipts and planting records for the Hartwell Oak Nursery. She did not reply. Summer came and the grove grew. The distillery master came in June as Thomas had promised, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Paquet, who asked questions for 3 hours, and then said quietly that she thought they could work together if Lena was willing to be patient. Lena said that patience was a thing she had learned young and kept. By September, the Cooperage was a working business. Small, still, but working. The grove now had 3 rows of healthy young Hartwell oaks that would be timber in another 4 years. She had 3 standing orders from regional producers for pickling and preserving casks, and a developing contract with Glenmore and Ash for aging barrels that would begin when the first managed timber was ready to harvest. Thomas drove up twice a month, and they stood in the grove and talked about tannins and grain and time. The old man did not come back, and she did not go looking for him. Some people appear exactly when they are needed, and not a moment before or after, and you learn to receive that without requiring more. On a Friday evening in late September, Lena stood at the door of the Cooperage as the sun went down over the field. The young oaks cast long, thin shadows across the grass. The building behind her smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil, and the faint sweetness of new timber, a smell she had known all her working life and still stopped to notice. Marion's truck was parked at the edge of the road. Thomas's last letter was on the workbench, still waiting to be answered. She had Amos Frey's mallet in her right hand. She had carried it from Sable Creek in a canvas bag, and she would carry it, she expected, until she no longer could. Its handle was warm from her grip. The groove was deeper now with her own wearing of it, layered over his, 2 hands' worth of use in the same wood. The town of Hartwell had not seen a working Cooperage in 35 years. Gustav Delic had spent his life trying to make the world notice something it was not ready to notice, and the world had not been ready. He had written his notes for whoever came after, if anyone did, because he understood that some work is not finished by the person who begins it, but by the person who finds it. Lena Voss had bought a ruin for $38 and found a legacy inside it. Not because she was remarkable, but because she had been taught to look at a piece of wood and ask what it actually is rather than what it seems to be. Amos had given her that. And before Amos, Gustav had given it to someone who hadn't come, and had trusted that eventually someone would. She looked at the grove, and she looked at the building, and she thought about the long chain of it. All the patient, uncelebrated work that makes a thing possible, and how most of it is never seen. Then she went back inside and picked up her tools, because there was still an hour of good light left, and she did not like to waste it. "We'll leave her there if you don't mind." At the workbench in the last of the evening light, doing the thing she was made for. "Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever found something that everyone else had given up on? A place, a skill, a piece of your own history, and brought it back to life? Tell us in the comments below. And if Lena's story stayed with you, leave us a like and subscribe to Cottage Stories. We'll be back soon with another tale of quiet work and stubborn hope.